The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Attorney General Jeff Sessions has been fired by Donald Trump. Protests already planned all over the country for 5 p.m. local time this afternoon. You might be wondering, why am I saying fired? Because there are some reports that say resigned. There are other reports that say forced out. The bottom line is that Donald Trump wasn't pleased with Jeff Sessions dating all the way back to 2017. And ultimately, it's up to Trump whether Jeff Sessions remains Attorney General or does not. And there is every indication from the reports that it was Trump's decision to force Attorney General Jeff Sessions out. This has everything to do with the Trump-Russia investigation and Robert Mueller. We will talk about that, the legal implications, as well as the interim or acting replacement for Jeff Sessions. Where to start? I guess with what Donald Trump said, and not unexpected in many ways. This was a predictable firing. Even the timing, we could argue, was predictable. And what Donald Trump said on Twitter is that we are pleased to announce that Matthew G. Whitaker, Chief of Staff to Attorney General Jeff Sessions at the Department of Justice, will become our new acting Attorney General of the United States. He will serve our country well. We thank Attorney General Jeff Sessions for his service and wish him well. A permanent replacement will be nominated at a later date, the day after the election, because Trump knows, or was advised more likely, that if he does it before the midterms, people might change their votes, realizing that this is part of Donald Trump's plan to interfere with Robert Mueller's investigation period. Former FBI Special Agent Asha Rangappa tweeting earlier today that even this firing would potentially be relevant to a case against Trump for obstruction of justice. And in fact, right before the tweets about the firing, Donald Trump tweeted about Robert Mueller as the last tweet before firing Jeff Sessions, and as usual, referring to the Russia investigation as a witch hunt. So it's as if we needed that to realize that these issues are related, and the timing of the tweets, the timing of the firing, everything about this is making it very, very clear. And in general, things that you do hours after an election are done that way specifically because you identify that there's risk to doing it that way before the election. Also interesting, acting Attorney General. We're going to talk about Matthew Whitaker in a second, but the idea of putting in an acting Attorney General, it could be a long time until a permanent Attorney General is put in. And the difficulty of that confirmation might actually be part of Donald Trump's plan to keep an acting Attorney General in for a long time, as long as possible, potentially, depending on what happens with Robert Mueller's Trump-Russia probe. And part of why it might be difficult if Trump's plan is to eventually put in Matthew Whitaker specifically as Attorney General, that could be made difficult by the reality that Whitaker literally wrote an op-ed for CNN arguing against the Mueller investigation and explaining how he would go about shutting it down. Understand this, and we're showing the article that he wrote some months ago to our television and YouTube audience. The guy who is taking over for Jeff Sessions has publicly stated how he would end the Mueller investigation, which he believes goes too far, and he would do it basically by starving it of funding, which is a common right-wing tactic. We've seen them try to do this with Obamacare. We've seen them try to take apart welfare programs by simply starving them of funding, and that's exactly what Matthew Whitaker says he would do. So first and foremost, Pat, this particular timing is very obvious in terms of what it means. And then he's putting in not someone who might be hostile to the investigation, but someone who is on the record as being hostile to the investigation and having a specific plan as to how he would end it.
And chop, too. I don't think they have too much time that they can waste. I think that's why Sessions was fired immediately, because it seemed from Mueller's team that they were going to come out with some of their findings after the midterm elections. Maybe some indictments are underway soon, too, like Donald Trump Jr., even Jared Kushner, Roger Stone. Those names have been mentioned. So they have to do it all very, very quick. And I think that this story is going to end pretty soon.
You think that the investigation, in other words, is going to be coming to a close soon, and that thus part of, I mean, that would be an argument for the sort of futility of even doing this, because I've read a few analyses which say if indeed Mueller is getting ready to wrap this up, then changing Attorney General now to one who's not recused on Russia potentially wouldn't even really do that much, because we may already have all the indictments prepared already. And that sort of is a question. There is both an urgency and also a possible futility. And it's important to understand that even though Sessions was beleaguered, as per Trump, as we've heard many times, partially for recusing himself on all Russia-related matters after being caught lying about his own contacts with Russia, I will remind you, he was actually a loyal Trumpist in Trump's administration, in a sense. And the unfortunate reality, if you're Trump, is that Matthew Whitaker also should recuse himself on anything related to Trump Russia, because he's tied up in it with an op-ed explaining how he would end an investigation that he doesn't think should be going on in the first place. And in fact, Nancy Pelosi has already called for Matthew Whitaker to replace him, to recuse himself, even though Trump has been slamming Sessions time and time again. Sessions stuck with it, and it's not totally clear yet whether Matthew Whitaker is going to be an effective sort of roadblock for this investigation. A few reminders of the long and troubled history between Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions. You will remember the tweet where Donald Trump said, Attorney General Jeff Sessions has taken a very weak position on Hillary Clinton crimes. Where are emails and DNC server and intel leakers? Yes, grammatically confusing, but publicly criticizing his attorney general, not something you normally see presidents do. And then maybe the first example of the public strife between Trump and Jeff Sessions was a tweet in February where Donald Trump said, why is AG Jeff Sessions asking the inspector general to investigate potentially massive FISA abuse, will take forever, has no prosecutorial power, and already late with reports on Comey, etc. Isn't the IG an Obama guy? Why not use Justice Department lawyers? Disgraceful. And more about the message sent by a president criticizing their own attorney general than the content, because the content was mostly nonsense. It's also important to consider the implications of Jeff Sessions being fired, because Sessions was, in a way, not just one of the loyal original Trumpists, but the last remaining major link to establishment Republicanism. And we've talked about that before, Pat, and I think that's even a point that you've made in the past, which is that Sessions is not a sort of Bannon, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, Kushner type, that he is an actual, and he's also not a military type. He is a guy from the establishment Republican base who was there with Trump, and now that link has been severed as well.
Yeah, he's more of an establishment type, and how ironic is it that left-wing groups are going to be protesting his firing all across the country? This is the guy that said that good people don't smoke marijuana, that he used to like the KKK until he found out that they smoke pot, something like that. You know, terrible record on criminal justice reform, and now, because politics makes strange bedfellows, we're all rallying to his support.
Well, I think what's important to point out there is that progressives and sensible Republicans who are going to protest today because of this firing, they're not doing it because they agree with Jeff Sessions' politics. And I think that it's actually refreshing in a way that what is being protested here is an attempt to get in the way of the normal course of justice and to get in the way of the checks and balances that we have. And it's interesting because without defending anything that Jeff Sessions stands for politically, you can still identify as all of the thousands and thousands of protesters who will be out today, and I'm going to stop by the protest in downtown Boston myself. They are out there because of what this represents. And by the way, you mentioned, Pat, the weed stuff. Jeff Sessions was one of the bigger escalators of the war on drugs. And if there is any silver lining politically in Sessions' firing, it's that maybe his firing will deflate some of those Trump Justice Department plans to re-escalate the war on drugs, which actually would be great. Now, on the merits, can Matthew Whitaker, the acting attorney general, as per Trump, replacing Jeff Sessions, can he stop the Mueller investigation? He can certainly use different tactics to try, and this is where Democrats need to come down on them if they do. They might be able to interfere with the investigation before the new Congress is inaugurated, which will include a democratically controlled House. And that also may be part of the urgency. There's a few different reads as to the immediate timing right after the 2018 midterm elections. And what's very clear is that they aren't going to go quietly. This is going to be insane for years. This all very transparently relates to the Russia probe, which we're going to get to next, because Trump's lawyers, according to Politico, have been advising Donald Trump to wait a little bit before firing Jeff Sessions, hoping to get more information from Mueller about what is in his findings and what is in his report. Donald Trump clearly has ignored that advice. And after the break, we're going to talk about breaking news related to the Russia probe. Pat alluded to it. Donald Trump Jr. now reportedly telling friends that he believes an indictment is imminent, soon expecting it. Send me your thoughts on the firing of Sessions. Get in touch if you're joining one of these protests around the country. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Miriam Gonzalez Vera. Miriam, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. Thanks for supporting alternatives to homogenous corporate media. We really appreciate everybody who has signed up, including since the midterms, which has just been a deluge of people, many using the coupon code This is 2020, because the 2020 election, for better or worse, has started now. And if we pretend it hasn't, we're going to get crushed again. Today's longtime sustaining member of the day is Chaka Blackman, who has been with us since November of 2013. 5 years of membership for Chaka. Miriam, Chaka, thanks to both of you. Sign up at www.joinpakman.com. Coupon code This is 2020 saves you 40% if you want it. If you don't want it, if you don't need it, it's lovely to pay full price. We have a David Pakman Show subreddit at davidpakman.com/reddit. Some very interesting posts on the subreddit that I noticed this morning. The first, a question: should Democrats abandon Florida? And what the poster argues is that it's clear that the state is never going to turn out for Democrats. It's also clear that Democrats waste a lot of money on Florida, and they never win. So should Democrats abandon Florida and focus on purple states and blue states? I totally disagree. Florida is a purple state. Florida is a state that Democrats do sometimes win in. And yeah, I sort of half jokingly mentioned yesterday in our post-election wrap-up that it seems in Florida you can run anybody against anybody, and you'll end up somewhere between 0.5 point and 2.5 points apart, and that can be frustrating. But I think Florida, given Florida's population and thus the number of electoral votes, the number of congressional districts, it would be a massive mistake for Democrats to abandon Florida. And I just disagree with the premise that Democrats can't win in Florida. They have won in Florida many times. Also from the David Pakman Show subreddit, this is, I love this. A user who goes by Pepperoni Pizza Bagels posted, "I'm quite possibly the only registered Democrat in my area. They changed my polling location. They change my polling location every election. So now it's a 21-mile round trip from my home. They'll never suppress my vote." I love it. I absolutely love it. And I think it's also a good reminder that, you know, I live a 1-minute walk, literally a 1-minute walk from where I vote here in Boston. And so many of us take for granted what it takes to just go and vote. and we have absolutely no understanding of what's going on elsewhere in the country. And so when we hear about polling locations closed, I mean, if you shut down my polling location and the 5 other closest polling locations, that probably extends my commute to vote to a 5-minute drive, right? So like we're in a different universe than what's going on in much of the United States, and that's why this is such a key and important issue. And I really appreciate the post and the fact that this person is voting. Pepperoni pizza bagels, all right. And lastly, from the David Pakman Show subreddit, playback speed. At which speed do you play the David Pakman Show podcast or YouTube videos? You know, Pat, it never occurred to me that someone might be listening to us on like 2x playback speed, but some people are. And I don't know if I should be offended or if it should be sort of a compliment that we're communicating so clearly that even at double speed, people are able to take in everything that we're saying.
I think people are just busy and they want to be as efficient as possible. I know when I have to listen to some Trump rambling speech or like a State of the Union by him, I always play that at 2x speed. But no, whenever I watch back the show, I actually slow it down. I do it at 0.5 times the speed because I want to capture every second of it.
Yeah, Pat doesn't want to miss any details in terms of what I'm saying on the program, which is very, very nice. You can join the David Pakman Show subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. Okay, yesterday Donald Trump held a press conference. It was his day after the election press conference. It was an utterly and completely embarrassing gong show, but there is one specific part that's getting the most attention. So some of the things we could talk about from the press conference include Donald Trump calling a question about racism racist. Donald Trump was asked about how he now calls himself a nationalist, and he said, that's a racist question. What that means, I couldn't tell you. He was particularly hostile to non-white members of the press. But the moment that's getting the most attention is when CNN's Jim Acosta asked a reasonably firm question, and Donald Trump started scolding him. A White House intern, as she's now being described, tried physically taking the microphone from Jim Acosta, and now the White House has decided to pull Jim Acosta's press credential, and they are claiming that they're doing it because Jim Acosta hit the White House intern. He laid hands on the White House intern, depending on which statement you look at, all of a sudden pretending that they're concerned about violence and aggression against women, which is just the most laughable thing in the world. So let's go through this piece by piece, starting with the exchange in question. If you're listening, you'll be able to hear it. If you're watching, you'll be able to also actually see this sort of entanglement of arms that takes place, which the Trump administration is now claiming was Jim Acosta laying hands on a woman.
Miles away. That's not an invasion.
Honestly, I think you should let me run the country. You run CNN.
All right.
And if you did it well, your ratings would be much better.
If I may ask one other question, Mr. President, if I may ask one other question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's enough.
Mr. President,
that's enough.
I was going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am. Mr. President,
that's enough.
Mr. President, I had one other question, if I may ask, on the Russia investigation. Are you concerned that you may have?
I'm not concerned about anything with the Russian
investigation
because it's a hoax. That's enough. Put down the mic.
Mr. President, are you worried about indictments coming down in this investigation?
Mr. President.
I'll tell you what, CNN should be ashamed of itself having you working for them. You are a rude, terrible person.
So there's a few layers to this. What took place is that a White House intern came over and tried to take the microphone from Jim Acosta while he was asking completely normal and reasonable questions. And Donald Trump responded to the questions by attacking him personally, saying he's a terrible person, or maybe he used the word horrible, and that CNN should be embarrassed that he works for them. And what you may have noticed is that in the midst of all this, when this White House intern is trying to physically remove the microphone from Jim Acosta, he actually says, "Pardon me, ma'am." And his hand sort of gets entangled with hers as she enters his personal space to rip the mic away. And he has the microphone in his right hand and his left hand gets entangled with hers. So already, just on the basis of this attack against Jim Acosta, this should be perceived as an attack on all media. And every single person in that press corps should be in total solidarity with Jim Acosta. That's number one. These attacks on the press must stop. But then hours later, Trump's just persistently dishonest press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, went on Twitter and announced that the Trump administration is banning Jim Acosta from the press corps because he hit a woman. Okay, she said, President Trump believes in a free press and expects and welcomes tough questions of him and his administration. We will, however, never tolerate a reporter placing his hands on a young woman just trying to do her job as a White House intern. They are saying that the problem is that Acosta touched the woman when clearly she approached a full-grown man and respected member of the press corps, tried to physically and forcibly remove the microphone from his hands, and he said, "Pardon me, ma'am," when their hands got tangled up. Not exactly a sign of aggression, and the most hypocritical part of this, Pat, is that they never cared about this issue, and now they're using it to suppress speech. They're not supporting the Violence Against Women Act. They immediately doubted the allegations of Brett Kavanaugh's sexual assault accusers, but now Jim Acosta's arm becomes entangled with the person trying to take his microphone in a suppression of speech, and they want to frame him as some kind of domestic abuser.
Yeah, when you watch the video back, and we will again, you can see it's much ado about nothing. And I think they are just trying to get rid of Jim Acosta because they find him to be a nuisance. And if you notice, if you look at the video, she's kind of pulling the mic, which causes one of his hands to pull down. You could make the argument that it's kind of a natural thing to happen, that his other arm also pulls down and just so happens to land on her. But even going into that amount of detail, I think, just plays into the White House's game.
Well, here is where it gets toxic. Right-wing media is agreeing that Acosta hit the intern, and they are partially defending this using a video that has been reportedly been doctored. And the video, it's not clear if it was created or spread by someone associated with Alex Jones's InfoWars. I don't even know that I have to name the guy because he's so toxic. Here's the original clip with audio, okay? And you'll see the speed at which things happen, and you'll notice that there's nothing aggressive or malicious from Jim Acosta, particularly when you hear him say, "Pardon me, ma'am," as soon as there's physical contact.
Question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's enough.
President,
That's
I was going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am. Mr. President.
That's
And then here is the one that has been spread by right-wing media, possibly by this InfoWars dude, and we're going to look at it. And what you will notice, first of all, is that most of the video has been slowed down, and then the moment that the arm tangle happens, the video goes way faster to comparatively appear as a karate chop, which is literally what they have been calling it on Twitter, saying that Jim Acosta karate chopped the White House intern. This is literal fake news. And importantly, they removed the sound so that you can't hear him say, "Pardon me, ma'am," as the tangle happens, because of course that's also not the language of an aggressive wife beater, which is what this edited version of the video is supposed to imply. And this subtle editing of the Acosta video by speeding up ever so slightly that particular moment is calculated to increase the rage. It has now been watched 100,000 times or more. And the fact that it was doctored doesn't even matter. People see the video as validating what happened as per Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Doesn't matter if the video's been edited. It's now part of the distorted narrative. And for all we know, this entire thing was pre-planned, given how the intern started inching closer and closer and closer to Jim Acosta as he was asking questions, looking at Trump for some kind of signal or approval to go and try to physically grab the mic. These aren't protesters at a rally, right? Jim Acosta's a member of the press corps speaking to the President of the United States. If they lie about this, they will lie about anything. We know that they will lie about anything. They are using all of this, the firing of Sessions, getting Jim Acosta out of there, not answering questions in a serious way about the Trump-Russia investigation. It is all meant to end the investigation, and they are going beyond what we've seen so far. And in the end, this is a horrible attack on the press, but it is also a distraction from the more aggressive methods being used to stop the Trump-Russia investigation, including what we started the show with, the firing of recused on Russia Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and we cannot ignore that.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It is great to be joined today by Simon Gottschalk, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. His latest book, The Terminal Self, looks at how our activities online at the terminal transform us. He's also author of a very interesting article called The Infantilization of Western Culture, which is going to be the subject matter today. Simon, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm very interested in this topic of the infantilization of Western culture, because very often when you hear such claims made, they often are associated with sort of libertarian beliefs, which often say that the government has sort of become a nanny state that is too involved in making sure no one does anything that might induce self-harm of any kind. But when you talk about the infantilization of Western culture, it's not a libertarian critique at all, is it?
No, not at all. No,
Can you talk a little bit about your critique on that line?
Yeah, well, I think that the institutions in which we participate in everyday life fail to treat us as adults. So think, for example, about education, or think about the workplace, or think about the mass media. It seems that in many of those institutions, we are treated as disobedient children who constantly need to be surveilled and need to be tested and need to be measured and need to be controlled. As a simple example, because of course I'm connecting the argument of infantilization to our activities at the terminal. But for example, today we are completely denied the right to privacy. So whenever we go online, whenever we click on anything, all kinds of informations are being recorded about us, even in the private sphere, even at home. And it seems to me that the right to privacy is a fundamental adult right. But we have all somehow surrendered to the fact that we have no longer privacy. Whatever we do can be observed, can be recorded, and at some point may be used against us. And that to me is just one example of how our activities at the terminal encourage a sort of infantile and submissive attitude rather than an adult one.
So let's go through a few examples of that. I mean, would you say that any instances of privacy being exchanged for the possibility or the perception, for example, of security, do those also count as instances of infantilization? So, for example, airport security, where we are effectively agreeing if we travel that TSA gets to look through our stuff and maybe even, put us through one of those porno scanners, as I call them. Is that, would that count as infantilization, even if it is under the guise of security?
No, I think that if it's in the guise of security, if it's really justified under the guise of security, then no, I would say that that form of surveillance is acceptable. But I'm thinking about just everyday activities, looking for a movie or reading a newspaper or connecting with someone or going online to find a location for a place. Meaning whatever we do at the terminal is being recorded and constitute an invasion of privacy for no good reason. I mean, we forget that there was a time not too long ago, and this is a time when I grew up, where all those activities would leave no trace, meaning there was no record of whether you would read a newspaper or look at a map or check a movie or consult a particular website. I mean, there was a time where all those activities were not recorded and were not leaving any trace. They were not endangering your privacy. And today, whatever we do at the terminal endangers the sense of privacy. It is, for example, very well known that even if your system is turned off, it can still transmit information about where you are and what you're doing. This is why even Mark Zuckerberg has placed a Post-it on the eye of his laptop camera. So all our devices, even in the private sphere, all our devices can be activated remotely to collect information about us, or conversations can be listened to, or emails can be captured. And I don't see any good reason as to why we have to submit to that very infantilizing regime.
So surveillance we've talked about as an infantilizing force in culture. Can you give us a couple of other examples?
Of infantilization?
Yes, please.
Just watch your local news. I mean, I watch the local news here in Las Vegas, but I've lived in other places in the United States. And in contrast to the news which are being broadcast in other societies where I've lived, I think that we are being talked down as if we were little retarded children. The news are being given to us in bite-sized, completely, in particular packages that don't really mean anything, that don't go into any depth, that are supposed to entertain us. News is not entertainment. News is serious business. And so that's another example of how I think that the mass media, politicians are talking down to us as if we were retarded children rather than approaching us as adults who are capable of understanding complex arguments.
So what you mentioned, entertainment, I'm interested in this. When it comes to entertainment, how can we distinguish between infantilized adults and adults that are having fun in a way that is not detrimental? So like a sporting event, I think, would be an example. Like, I'm from Argentina. Soccer is huge in Argentina. And I sometimes am able to sort of intuitively distinguish between someone who seems to be a little bit too into it as an adult in a way that seems to start to separate from sort of just like the culture and tradition of it, and just adults who seem well adjusted and are enjoying it. Can you talk about that a little bit when it comes to adults and entertainment?
Well, no, I think that it's perfectly okay for adults to engage in activities that, are playful. And actually, it's very healthy for adults to engage in playful activities. But what I'm concerned about is more of an ideology that seems to consider us as little children that need to be entertained either by mind-numbing spectacles or even more toys. I've got some statistics on that. The amount of money that the adults today are spending on toys, on unnecessary objects that are just making life a little bit more amusing or more entertaining or more convenient is absolutely astronomical. If you look at the increase of the amount of money spent, for example, between the 1950s and today, it's absolutely monumental how much money we spend in order to just entertain ourselves. And I think also that the forms of entertainment are infantilizing because, and here again, I'm especially concerned by our activities at the terminal. Again, when we use our terminal, we are immersing ourselves in a very self-contained world that is very personalized. This is one of the magic of the terminal. Like no other technology, we can personalize our terminal to our specifications and to our taste and to our personality, so that when we turn towards the terminal, we are engulfed into a particular world that is very self-centered, that is one, and where we feel very self-sufficient, because whatever we like is there in front of us, and whatever we do not like has been eliminated from the terminal. But that's a very infantilizing way of approaching life, if you will, because real life is not specified to our taste. Real life also contains events and people and opinions that we don't like. Real life does not accommodate to our desires. Real life does not respond to whatever it is that we feel like having right now.
And when I hear you saying that, what I actually now am realizing that there are very similar arguments made against the sort of safe space, trigger warning status quo that has surfaced in some college campuses. Now, I want to be really clear because you may not know my view on this, Simon, and people in the audience, it's good to restate it. I don't believe that the college campus safe space trigger warning phenomenon is as widespread as some people believe it to be. But to the extent that it exists, I do find it problematic. And I find it problematic for the reasons you're stating, which is that it doesn't seem to do any favors to students in that it doesn't prepare them for the way that the world seems to work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I fully agree that real life is going to be populated by individuals who are ferociously against your opinions and who are going to say things that will make you uncomfortable. And so it doesn't do anybody any good to cocoon if you will, young adults, individuals who are about to enter the real world and the marketplace, it doesn't do anybody any good to protect them so much. I mean, actually, I think that university education is precisely, among other things, I mean, besides studying your particular discipline, it's also about preparing you intellectually and emotionally to face a world that, again, does not accommodate to your taste and does not accommodate to your ideas, and that will challenge you. And we're doing a great disservice, I think, to the current generation of students on campuses, where we are insisting that they should not be exposed to uncomfortable information.
Now, in the article, you talk a little bit about the connection between this sort of infantilization and infantile thinking and authoritarian rule. And I'd be interested in hearing you talk a little bit about how you believe that connection exists.
Well, because there's a very interesting book called Consumed by Benjamin Barber, and he suggests that he sees the rise of what he calls an infantilist ethos. And he's saying that this particular way of thinking favors fast over slow, simple over complex, and more rather than less. And of course, politicians who explain complex arguments by following this particular logic, fast solution rather than long one, or simple explanations rather than complicated ones, of course, they tap into a particular infantile craving, if you will, that the world should be fast and easy and more of it, you know, more gadgets or more toys or whatever. And so politicians who are going to use that particular philosophy or that particular approach nurture those infantile tendencies. And I think that in a society, in a world as complex as the one in which we live, it would be completely foolish and delusional to believe that there are simple and fast solutions to anything.
But stunningly, I mean, that there is, I believe that in the United States, one of the reasons that the Republican Party has been as successful as it has been is that they do provide simple, neatly packaged explanations or positions. I mean, taxation is like a prototypical example. If you are on the right and you say, hey, it's your money, taxes should be as low as possible, it's extraordinarily simple, it's extraordinarily concise, and the left doesn't have an opposite. They don't say, we just want taxes as high as possible. They immediately launch into nuance, which I believe is, of course, necessary nuance, but you're already sort of losing when you can't simplify the argument.
Yes, unless we have a more educated population that understands
right.
that, you know, those quick and fast and simple arguments may make us feel good, but they really don't resolve anything. But in order for those kinds of arguments to penetrate, we need a population that does not surrender to those infantile impulses, to those infantile desires to be provided with simple and fast solutions by authoritarian father figures.
And what are some of the ways that society could be molded in that sense? I mean, I think not teaching critical thinking starting in middle school is a problem, but it might be naive to think that if you start teaching critical thinking when kids are 12, that it solves the problem. It seems that there's much more to it.
Yeah, because the education institution is just one node, if you will, of that infantilization. Right? The mass media is also infantilizing. The workplace is also infantilizing. But I think that, you know, starting to educate children early on into critical thinking would already produce different kinds of citizens. I mean, how is it that in other societies they manage to do it and they manage to do it very well? Right. For example, Finland is very frequently cited as one of the countries that scores the highest on happiness and well-being. People are extremely happy in Finland. People are typically very healthy. And Finland is probably the society with the best education. And it's also a very taxed country. That's people in Finland are very heavily taxed, but they don't see any problem with it. Right. So, I mean, as an educator, I believe that education is, you know, one particular place where I see the infantilization of the population, even in academia. And I mean, you know, I'm not an expert on, you know, on the economy, or I'm not an expert on the political institution, but, you know, as someone who works in the education institution, I can see where we can make tremendous progress, not in inculcating children into any ideology. I'm not interested in brainwashing, you know, students into voting right or voting left, but I think that it's very important to teach children and young adults the power of critical thinking, the power of being able to examine arguments logically rather than responding viscerally to what makes us feel good.
The article is The Infantilization of Western Culture. We've been speaking with the article's author, Simon Gottschalk, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Simon, really a pleasure speaking with you today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I do want to talk about this story, even though it's still very, very early. We don't have all of the information yet, but we do have some important and very, very disturbing information. 11 victims plus a police officer are dead, along with the shooter at yet another public mass shooting. This one happened at the Borderline Bar and Grill in Thousand Oaks, California. Very full bar last night. Shooter opens fire, kills 11 people, as well as a police officer who was responding to the incident. The shooter also dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and about a dozen other people have been injured. And police spokespeople have described the scene as horrific, with blood everywhere. The shooter has been identified. It is indeed another young white male, 28 years old. Heavily tattooed was part of the initial description that was released. We've now learned that he was a former U.S. Marine who showed up with a .45 caliber handgun, which had been reportedly legally purchased, as well as a or multiple smoke devices. At this time, once again, it's being reported that the shooter took his own life, not shot by police. It's also been reported that in April of this year, there was an incident involving the shooter that led to a mental health evaluation, which ended with the shooter being cleared by mental health experts. And there are some early reports that some of the people inside at yesterday's shooting were also at the location, at the event of the Las Vegas shooting that happened not that long ago, which is just unimaginable. I mean, just even having enough mass shootings that you've got people who are at more than one is extraordinarily disturbing. And we already know what will happen if and when the motivations of this individual become clear, if they ever do, because we often don't actually end up getting clarity. If it's a right-winger, then it's just a person who did this for no reason related to their politics whatsoever. If it's a left-winger, as they're already sort of priming the pump with by saying this was country music night at the bar, even in Thousand Oaks, if you go to country music night, you must be a right-winger, meaning the shooter was targeting right-wingers, of course, without any evidence whatsoever at this time. If it is a left-winger, they will create a counter-narrative that will completely ignore the string of right-wing terror in the United States. And it's too early to tell. It's very early in the story, but we should put politics completely aside for a moment, if it's possible, and realize that this is just happening too often, because even that you can't get universal agreement on. You actually see comments online from people who say, country of 340 million people, even if it's statistically super safe, there are still going to be lots of these, and many people even refusing to acknowledge that this is a problem. Hopefully more information soon. Just another absolutely horrible incident. Breaking news. As predicted by people connected to reality but denied by Trumpists, it seems Donald Trump Jr. is now expecting to be indicted, and, quote, soon. 2 days ago, Gabriel Sherman reported in Vanity Fair that people at the White House are, quote, very worried about Donald Trump Jr. Politico has now broken the news that Donald Trump Jr. has been privately telling his own friends that he believes he could be indicted. And the big area of, I guess we would call it interest, or what would the subject matter of the indictment be? It looks like it could be related to the fact that Donald Trump Jr. testified that he never, under oath, that he never spoke to his father, Donald Trump, about that infamous Trump Tower meeting where Russians promised dirt on Hillary Clinton. Did he lie about that? If he did, that's bad not only for Trump Jr., but it's also very bad for Trump Sr. as well. And that could explain the rush to fire Attorney General Jeff Sessions and to put in place an interim replacement who is very hostile to the Trump-Russia investigation, because if Trump Jr. lied about not having spoken to Trump Sr. about the meeting in advance, that means Trump Sr. knew about the meeting in advance, which immediately implicates Donald Trump in potentially more crimes. And the Gabriel Sherman article says that the White House insiders are worried that Mueller would indeed be able to prove that Donald Trump Jr. committed perjury. And with perjury very often being so difficult to prove, this would be absolutely massive. And then we've got to get to the meat of it. If indeed Donald Trump Jr. lied under oath, why did he do it? He obviously had an attorney with him. I'm sure that Don Jr.'s attorney said to him, you're going to be under oath. It's dangerous, legally speaking, to lie to federal investigators while under oath. It is a crime to do that. And if it's true, as they claim, that the Trump Tower meeting with Russians didn't actually produce anything of value to use against Hillary Clinton, why would Don Jr. feel the need to lie about it at all? Except if the meeting did have follow-up and Don Jr. had told his father, the reason he would lie is that he'd be making the call. He'd rather chance lying to investigators than admitting that, yes, his father was a knowing part of the effort to conspire with a foreign country for the purposes of winning an American election, which exposes them to all kinds of criminal charges. And just a reminder, you remember this, Pat. Remember when Steve Bannon said about Don Jr. a year ago or so, I think it was late December, January, when Steve Bannon's book came out, quote, they're going to crack Don Jr. like an egg on national TV. This may be the beginning of trouble for Don Jr. And correct me if I'm wrong, Pat, you've been saying Don Jr. is one of the top indictee possibilities for a while.
Oh, yeah, I'm not alone in saying that, too. I think this would be an absolute bombshell if Donald Trump Jr. was to be indicted. And then who knows what would happen from there. I think Trump would be in a position where he'd have to pardon his own son, maybe even fire Robert Mueller and the investigation, and we have a constitutional crisis on our hands. I don't think he'd be so willing to do that for people like Paul Manafort, for Michael Flynn, for Michael Cohen. But his own son, I think he would pull all the plugs, pull out all the stops, and make sure that his son's not going to be locked up.
Don Jr., he was basically a water boy. He had nothing to do with the campaign. He had and has nothing to do with the president of the United States, Donald Trump, at all. My prediction is Trump won't literally say he doesn't really think Don Jr. was a key part of the campaign. That would obviously be silly. But I actually do think that Trump is going to throw Don Jr. under the bus to some degree. And the reason why I think that is that we've already learned that when the initial news of the Trump Tower meeting first broke, we learned that Trump was reportedly absolutely furious with Don Jr. And nothing had even really happened then. Like, we didn't know at that point how big that meeting and the circumstances that led up to it were going to become. So grab the popcorn. This is going to get extraordinary very, very soon, Pat.
With the ranking of Donald Trump's kids, I think Don Jr. is probably like third. Like, if this happened to Ivanka Trump, investigation would be totally over. Ivanka would be pardoned. If it happened to Barron, which I don't foresee happening, maybe Trump would get upset as well. But once you start getting down to Donald Trump Jr., to Eric, to Tiffany Trump, maybe he doesn't care so much.
I actually think the ranking for Trump would be that Ivanka is his favorite, particularly, all those times he's talked about how amazing her body is. It seems he really, really seems to think of her as just the tops. Then I would say it's Eric Trump. Then I would say it's Don Jr. And then sort of at the bottom, I think it's Tiffany and Barron, who he just doesn't even really seem to talk about. That's my ranking. I don't know. What do I know? We have a voicemail number, 2192-DAVID-P. Here's a call from a Christian Democrat. Take a listen to this.
Hi, David. This is Ezekiel from Allendale, Michigan. I'm a Christian Democrat, and I've noticed over the time that shows like the Young Turks and some others will say that conservatives don't understand the Bible, which I would agree with, but then they go on to try and explain that by misrepresenting the Bible themselves. Do you think that's an advantageous strategy, or do you think progressives should work on focusing on the issues that are clearly outlined by the Bible and try and push forward with those ideas?
Yeah, I actually don't really see the Bible as a relevant thing to politics, but that's my biased view. I need to understand the reality that for a lot of people in this country, the Bible is very relevant. And we actually had on election night, I had one person call in and cite Bible passages in one particular way and connecting them to politics in a particular way. And then someone else called in and said, hey, no, I know about the Bible. That other guy didn't. Here's the actual way that goes. I actually think it's a loser's game. I don't think progressives should engage on this in any way. And you'll remember when Barack Obama, during a debate in 2008, was asked about his favorite Bible verse. And I think that we didn't see, hey, Pat, correct me if I'm wrong. Did we see questions about favorite Bible verses during the Trump-Hillary debates? Maybe there was, and I just don't remember.
I certainly hope not. I don't know what Trump's favorite Bible verse is. I don't think he'd be able to name one offhand, but it would probably come from 2 Corinthians.
Yes, 2 Corinthians are a source of a lot of enjoyment for Donald Trump, clearly. Yeah, listen, I would just like to see us get away from the Bible at all and not use the Bible as an adjudicating document at all for politics and what the right policy is and what the wrong policy is. I think that for those who are self-described Christians, I think that they can realistically hold themselves up to the standard that one would argue most charitably was established by Jesus, if that's who they believe to be their God, leader, savior, whatever. But I would like to see politics completely removed and not even have these pissing matches, for lack of a better term, about who knows the most about how politics would align with this book from the Bible or that book from the Bible. Let's just stop the entire thing. We've got a fantastic bonus show for you today. We are going to talk about ballot measures across the country. We will have an update on the tech situation in the studio, which will be, I predict this is close to the end of tech updates. It's probably the 11th to the last tech update. So not that many tech updates coming. 2 ways to get the bonus show: become a member at www.joinpakman.com, become a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. We'll speak to you then. It's a good one today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.